Now we are going over Destruction Warlock. I'm going over Destruction after Elemental because I believe they are the two best, most smooth, most clean and nice and free-flowing specs in the range department. Elemental is a little bit more varied, it has a little bit more options between the talents and the abilities they can choose, whereas Destruction is a little bit more on rails, but it's still a very smooth spec. Now, yes, from BFA, you have lost quite a few things when it comes to borrowed powers. You're not feeling this yet fully in the pre-patch because you still have access to Azerite traits and you still have access to essences. So you can still use things like Vision of Perfection, you can still use things like Crushing Chaos to line up your Infernal with your Dark Soul instability every single time. You add Azerite traits like Rolling Havoc and most importantly like Flashpoint, which completely warped your rotation. You add 0.4 Incinerate cast times thanks to Flashpoint. This spiked up your intellect from Rolling Havoc, and then you entered your Infernal window with massive amount of intellect, massive amount of haste for your Chaos Bolt spam, and it was a mess. Yes, now it's gonna be lost. In Shadowlands it's not gonna work that way anymore, but it's still gonna be very nice to play. Specifically because there has also been some attempts by Blizzard to move you a little bit more towards a fire-based build. At the very least to make it seem like your spells do something else outside of Chaos Bolt, right? Because that's basically all that Destruction is right now in BFA, it's just Chaos Bolt. Everything else is irrelevant. So before we go in depth, I'm going to point out in the description box down below there is the macros for Destruction Warlock and there is the Wikora that I'm using in this video. This Wikora comes from Afenar. I'm gonna link his wago.io profile page as well as his Twitter in the description box. Mine is a slightly modified version, but you can just pick whichever you enjoy the most. This is a pretty fine one as far as Warlock goes. But now let's go over how Destruction plays. Destruction still plays very similarly to BFA, so if you didn't plan on playing Destruction in BFA, then not much is gonna change in Shadowlands. You build soul shards or soul shard fragments. 10 fragments make 1 soul shard, up to 5. You build them with Immolate, Incinerate and Conflagrate. Immolate is 1 soul shard fragment and an extra 1, 50% chance when you crit. Incinerate is 2 fragments and 1 extra when you crit. And then Conflagrate is 5 fragments, or Alpha Shard. And you spend it with Chaos Bolt on single target or Cleave when you're using Havoc, and then Rain of Fire for pure AoE. Mentioning the fact that, unlike Elemental, Destruction is a little bit more on rails, a little bit more restricted in its choices, which has been one of the weaknesses in BFA, is the fact that their talent tree doesn't really allow for much flexibility. The abilities they can use from the talent tree, like Soulfire, like Shadowburn, and like Channel Demon Fire, don't really open themselves to being part of your core rotation, of your everyday use, on top of not being very strong and not being generally taken anyways. The main playstyle of Destruction Warlock from BFA remains the same in Shadowlands. You want to pull your soul shards, you want to pull your charges of Conflagrate, ready to try to fill in as many Chaos Bolts back to back on the same target. This is particularly needed when you're trying to use your big CD, your Infernal and your Dark Soul instability. Infernal lasts for 30 seconds, Dark Soul instability lasts for 20, so you want to have a 10-second window where you build up your Infernal, you build up your soul shards, and then you can use your trinkets and your Dark Soul instability 10 seconds into your Infernal. When it comes to your Havoc window, it's just about a similar situation where Havoc is now 12 seconds. You want to build up your soul shards to 5, your Conflagrate charges, and then you use your Havoc, your Immolate, and then you start going off on Chaos Bolts, replenish your soul shards with an instant Conflagrate, get some backdraft buffs for faster cast of Chaos Bolt, and try to fill in and fit in as many Chaos Bolt casts as possible within that window. This window can be some talent, some procs, some trinkets, anything that can increase the damage of your Chaos Bolt. This was obviously dragged down to the absolute extremes by the end of BFA, thanks to traits like Rolling Havoc and Crushing Chaos, making it insanely OP. In Shadowlands it will obviously be on a smaller scale, but it will function in the same way. Talking about talents, there has been some positive change, trying to maybe sway Destruction a little bit more towards the fire-based build. Fire and Brimstone and Roaring Blaze are now going to focus on your fire damage. Fire and Brimstone particularly is going to make your Incinerate splash AoE damage, and most importantly give you 2 soul shard fragments per additional enemy hit, which means if you're fighting 5 targets you're gaining 1 shard every Incinerate cast at the very least, which is very massive, and it can become even better later on, we will see. Roaring Blaze is just extra fire damage. This is trying to shift you a little bit further away from the BFA version of Warlock, which is currently just Chaos Bolt damage. Every other ability falls in the background. Every other ability doesn't really matter. It's everything and anything for the sake of Chaos Bolt. These two talents try to, shift you a little bit further away from it. Now, whether they will actually be successful or not, considering Reign of Chaos is also a new talent which is incredibly powerful for your Infernal window, we're not quite sure, but at least it's a start. Especially for Mythic Plus, this seems very powerful. Fire and Brimstone, that is. Now, on a sour note, the Covenant abilities of Destruction Warlock are actually very disappointing. They have been nerfed through and through multiple times. Decimating Bolt is pretty weak for Destruction since it functions on your Incinerate, which isn't very powerful in and of itself. If it functioned with Chaos Bolt, then sure, but unfortunately it doesn't. Your Soul Rot is also pretty bad, because you are not Affliction, you don't have the ability to synergize with your Drain Life, so it's not really powerful for Destruction. Impending Catastrophe also has no synergy with your toolkit. Applying DOTs to multiple targets doesn't really do anything for you as a Destruction Warlock, and the actual damage of Impending Catastrophe has been gutted by 50%, which means you are most of the time going to be left with Corwin Tithe. It's not particularly strong on a single target environment, it's just going to be an extra source of damage over time. It can be much more powerful in Mythic Plus, where you can carefully use it to snipe enemies and give you a full refill of soul shards, so you can go into the next pack with full shards from the start. You would be essentially playing with a do-it-yourself Drain Soul as a Destruction, since you normally don't have access to Drain Soul. What really makes the spec more interesting, though, is going to be your Legendaries, because the Legendaries of Destruction are actually pretty interesting. You do have some way to remind and reminisce about your Vision of Perfection, because Wilfred's Sigil is going to reduce the cooldown of your Infernal whenever you spend Soul Shards. This is going to be very powerful, because even with low stats, you can nearly lower this down to a 2-minute cooldown already, which lines up perfectly with your Dark Soul cooldown. So this is probably going to be your 2-go talent specifically for raids and single target encounters. It's very powerful. But there are also some very interesting things. Cinders is going to give you an extra conflagrate and charge reduction. This is going to be particularly helpful at the start of the expansion, when you will be having fuck all haste. This is going to make your rotation much more smooth. It's going to basically give you the impression that you have more haste than you actually have, thanks to this. It helps smoothing out your rotation, although when it comes to power, I'm not sure if it can match up with extra Infernal casts. Madness of the Ajakir is going to be very powerful later in the expansion. No, this does not stack, and the fact that the buff only lasts for 3 seconds, it makes it very difficult at the start of the expansion to be able to chain this buff multiple times with your Chaos Bolts. Later in the expansion, this is going to be very good. Odor is just compounding on your best trait as Destruction, which is Cleave. This is just going to give you an extra boost for your Cleave, particularly powerful on Cleave fights in raid encounters. This is going to be very, very good. And then we have the Embers of Diabolic Raiment. Now, if you remember, 3 minutes ago I mentioned that Fire and Brimstone is going to give you 2 extra fragments per extra target hit around your Incinerate damage, and guess what? This actually works with that. You can actually now gain 4 Soul Shard fragments per Incinerate cast and an extra 4 per target close to your main target. This is a borderline 2 to 3 Soul Shards per Incinerate cast in Mythic Plus. Coupled with the fact that your Rain of Fire has been buffed in baseline damage and it can stack on itself, this is becoming very, very powerful for Mythic Plus, for your AoE, your sustained AoE. So this could be much stronger for Mythic Plus and AoE encounters. So there is variety here. You have solid Legendaries that can buff your Incinerate Soul Shards gain, which can be used for both Chaos Bolt generation or Rain of Fire generation. You have the buff to Havoc for your Cleave, you have the buff to your Chaos Bolt for your single target, you have your overall buff as a cooldown reduction on your Infernal. Very, very diverse and versatile Legendaries available for Destruction. It is their strongest point coming into Shadowlands, which sort of makes up for the absolute terrible state of their Covenants. In the end, when it comes to Destruction Warlock, they have retained similar strengths and similar weaknesses that they had in BFA. They still have very low ramp-up time required, thanks to basically just needing Immolate on the target before they can get going. This gives them access to very good burst thanks to their cooldowns. Their Infernal and their Dark Soul instability are very, very strong put together. You have lost Vision of Perfection and Crushing Chaos, but you do have now another way with a Legendary to be able to line them up as well. Your burst is very, very strong for both single target AoE and cleave. Your cleave, you're still the king of cleave thanks to Havoc, and now you're pretty versatile. For single target AoE and cleave, you do have multiple choices and options now compared to before. However, your defensives are still pretty poor. You're still stuck to a single button, which is Unending Resolve, which is very poor. 40% DR on a 3-minute cooldown, as well as your mobility. Your mobility is tied to pre-planning and premeditation because you have gateways and portals. You don't have a oh shit movement button like a blink, a dash, or a charge. You have Burning Rush as your only other option. Your damage is still pretty average outside of your cooldowns. You are one of the specs that is more reliant on big cooldowns than others. Since I mentioned Elemental Shaman as my first spec I went over, that's a good example of a very stable and consistent damage spec, whereas Destruction is more ups and downs, ups and downs, ups and downs, cycling around their cooldowns. Overall, to me, it looks like a very nice spec, because even counting and even taking into account the loss of the Azerite traits, the loss of the essences, and the corruptions which made Destruction go into overdrive at the end of BFA, they have actually picked up very well at the start of Shadowlands. Look at the way I treated other specs that have been dependent on borrowed powers, like Protection Warrior, like Fire Mage, and now look at Destruction. Destruction was almost, if not as much, dependent on borrowed powers as those specs at the end of BFA. And now they still look great at the start of Shadowlands. This is very important. If you actually figured this out before, you should have been very scared about your Destruction Warlock coming into Shadowlands, given how stronger you became thanks to borrowed powers. And now they lost them all, and they're still a very nice spec. They're very smooth, they're very nice to play. Despite having only 4 to 5 buttons, it still flows really, really well, which is a good thing. If you want a simpler spec with slightly less buttons, with very big satisfying cooldowns to press, then Destruction is your choice. And with the Destruction pick, we are now done with the second spec I am going over. This was the second range DPS spec, so my next spec is going to be a melee DPS one. So go on in the comments and take your pick for melee DPS spec. No? Survival and Feral don't count. Give me something else, please. Thank you. Okay, so while you decide the next spec, in the meantime, I'm going to work on some more flute songs.